Now, tomorrow marks International Women's Day. Coronavirus of course, affected everyone in so many ways, but there have been some issues that have hit women particularly hard, whether it's on childcare, job prospects or domestic abuse. Yesterday, I spoke to the Executive Director of UN Women, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, and I asked her whether things have improved or got worse for women around the world in the last year.
Well, we unfortunately have been hard hit by the pandemic. And some of the gains that we made in the last 2 decades especially are under significant threats. During the pandemic, women have lost most of the jobs, about 2/3 of the jobs that were lost were jobs that belonged to women. And this is because women tend to be at the lower end with jobs that are not protected, with jobs that do not have enforceable contracts, and in some countries are not even covered by the labor laws. So it's very easy to get rid of women in times of crisis. We've seen girls dropping out of school in larger numbers. Again, this is one area where we've been making progress in the last 2 decades. But also women's leadership is not being taken as seriously as we need to be taking it serious. And we've seen now, even during this crisis, that in the task teams and committees that are dealing with COVID, women are underrepresented. In 87 countries that we surveyed, only about 3.6 have gender equal a representation of men and women. And you can't have men fixing the issues that affect women most.
It's interesting you're talking there about women in leadership throughout the pandemic, because in countries where we've had women leaders, there's actually been quite a lot of praise for how they've dealt with it in places like New Zealand and Germany, for instance.
Absolutely. And this year's theme for International Women's Day is on women's leadership. There is an opportunity here at the back of this pandemic to actually promote women's leadership. And we have this evidence of women who have performed very well and have managed the pandemic in an impressive way.
You talked about women in the workplace and the impact it's had. And of course, in the UK, it's also had a big impact on how women are doing in the workplace in the pandemic. So, for example, 17% of mothers in the UK said they've had to give up on work during the pandemic. Mothers on the lowest incomes 9 times more likely to have lost their jobs. Do you worry that even in places like the UK and wealthy nations, that the pandemic could set back women's progress potentially decades?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just for women slipping out of the labor market is a big issue. And in countries like the UK, where women did achieve much better representation in the labor market, it is going to cost us a lot to have those women now not earning and not being able to be as independent as they were as working mothers, working women.
Another aspect that we've seen in the UK is in domestic violence, the number of people reporting domestic violence. The UN's described it as a shadow pandemic. How concerned are you that as we're told to stay at home, it's actually not a safe place for so many women?
We have called this increase of gender-based violence a pandemic of its own, a shadow pandemic that has existed before there was COVID-19 and will continue to exist after COVID-19. So we need to fight it, not just for what is happening now during the pandemic, but fight it for the future as well, and deal with it as a pandemic with all hands on deck. In the context of gender-based violence, our frontline workers, our social workers, the police, civil society, the judiciary, all of those would need to make decisions that will prevent the violence from happening, as well as prosecute. In some countries, the increase has been as high as 40%.
I'm also interested as well if you're worried about increased nationalism, so countries effectively looking to protect themselves because they're dealing with the crisis of COVID, rather than reaching out and trying to help people in other countries. So in the UK, for example, we've reduced the aid budget from 0.7 to 0.5% of GDP. We've cut aid to Yemen. How much of a concern is this for the UN?
it really is concerning us, and we are appealing for countries to be generous at this time of need. Solidarity in a time like this is actually important, because in the fight against the pandemic, safety in one country when there is no safety in another country is not real safety. We need to fight the pandemic all over the world and to help each other, because we will not be able to be safer if one part of the world is not safe. The same thing about driving countries into extreme poverty. We know that when people are desperate, they will move around the world. So the people that you are leaving exposed to extreme poverty will show up on your doorstep at some point. So we have to be in this all together. We are also concerned about women who are refugees and migrants, and people who are refugees and migrants, because COVID has tended to push people out of countries that are hosting them back to their own countries, where sometimes they do not have the infrastructure to survive in their own countries because they already migrated to a new countries, and sometimes they don't have the papers to be moving back and forth. So migrants are finding themselves in very difficult situations. We're also concerned about equitable distribution of vaccine, because there is a danger also that women in some situations will not be given first preference for accessing the vaccine. If we know about the preference for boys, the preference for men could easily be in front of the line, claiming that they are the ones who are maybe going out to work, confining women in the home space, which comes with its own complications. So we want governments to pay attention to equitable distribution of the vaccine and make sure that women are not discriminated against.
Just finally, when I was researching the interview, I was just very struck by your own sort of background. Growing up in South Africa, a teacher, becoming South Africa's first female deputy president, also having 5 children. It's a pretty impressive CV. What is it about your own experience growing up and becoming a woman that really sort of drove you and has inspired you?
You know, I grew up in South Africa at a time of apartheid. So you were thrust into activism because of the situation of the country. I also had a mother who was an activist in her own right. So there was a push from the home front, but also as a student, my friends and fellow students were activists in the main. And in fact, for people of my age group, if you were not an activist, you really were somehow on the wrong track, because everything pointed you in a direction that called on you to take action about what was happening in the country. It was much easier to be an activist than to fold your hands.
That's very interesting. And thank you so much for being on the programme today and talking a bit about International Women's Day. We appreciate it.
Thank you.